This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. We are counting on you. Every week we bring you interviews with authors of books and research and other things that we find interesting. This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany is now holding the EU presidency for the second half of 2020. And as our listeners know, the Tel Aviv Review is holding a special series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and Germany. All this with their generous support.
Our guest today is a very interesting person. I've been trying to decide if we should introduce him as an enfant terrible or an agent provocateur. Max Czollek received his PhD from the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University in Berlin. He has published 3 poetry volumes in addition to nonfiction works on political science. Max co-curated many festivals, De-Integration, a conference on contemporary Jewish positions in 2016, and Radical Culture Jewish Days in 2017, and most recently, Days of the Jewish-Muslim Hegemony. We'll be talking about his book, De-Integrate Yourself, released in August 2018 and published by Hanser. We're going to be discussing this and other essays and some of his creative writing. Max lives and writes in Berlin, and we're interviewing him today from there. Max, welcome to the show.
Hello, good to be here.
Let's start with De-Integrate Yourselves. I have to say that reading this book, I'm going to start with the general tone. You sound angry about something. The book is quite a spirited sort of j'accuse against something to do with Holocaust memory in Germany today and bigger issues. What do you think has gone wrong?
Oh yeah, that's demanding right the straight major big hypothesis of my whole work right there.
That's what we're here for.
Let me try to take things apart and maybe arrive at that more general question of what is making me angry. Maybe to say a first thing about my writing, it'd be that I guess everyone is running on a different kind of fuel, and for me, anger is one of the basic components of my fuel. So the more angry I am, the better the work gets. It feels like that, at least. So writing De-Integrate Yourselves was really getting better the worse the situation got. And the situation when I started writing that book was after a new German right-wing party, AfD, had been elected to the German parliament, which had been the first right-wing focused party ever to be elected in that size to the general German Bundestag. And that really triggered something in me. That triggered some kind of defense mechanism, a lot of anger, and I was infuriated in a way. And that kind of flowed into that work. So I guess that was the first thing. Then the second thing was that De-Integrate Yourselves, as you already mentioned in my vita, was coming from an angle that was really based in theater. So in a way, writing this book, writing this polemic was in a way trying to do something I had been doing in political sciences, but doing it from a theater point of view, which would be more a polemical position of being on stage and addressing an audience, not being on stage, and doing something that, with the words of a Berlin rapper, would be a kind of continuous flow of thoughts where people couldn't interrupt me, and I could just continue going and ramble.
But Max, I'd like to go back to your first point, and ask. It seems that your beef is not with the far right in Germany, but with the broader German political discourse, with just German culture at large.
I don't know. As I read Max, he has a beef with both.
Yeah, well, I guess I got a beef with both. There's something interesting about a German discourse on the right wing, which tends to put everything that's going wrong and everything that is kind of reminding the public of the Nazi past to the fringes of society. So people would say, look, those things are going wrong because of the right wing, the extreme right wing. And I feel like this is the wrong question, because we have been like we've become used to the idea of Germany being non-Nazi and being good. That is, in my views at least, blocking a perception of the continuities that are still going on. So instead of asking what is the right wing doing, I have been asking in my artistic work and in my nonfiction of how our own idea of what Germany is and what Germany has become has had a part in the rise of the new German right.
So in a way, you're not just criticizing the relationship between Germany and Jews today. You're criticizing the relationship between Germany and Germany, between Germans and how they see themselves.
Yeah, that's correct. I'd say I'm much more a German writer than a Jewish writer. But that has already taken it way to the center of what I'm working on in De-Integrate Yourselves, because in a way, being a Jew in Germany always means being made a very specific kind of Jew in Germany, which is one serving the German desire to become good again. Why? Because as long as there are Jews living in Germany, as long as they're alive, in a way, there cannot be National Socialism, because in National Socialism, Jews are basically Schrödinger's Jews. Either they're already dead or they're still alive but should be dead. So in a way, having Jews living in Germany is already a living proof of the point you want to make as a German non-Jewish public. So in a way, criticizing that always means criticizing the way Jews are being functionalized and the way Germany has positioned itself to its own past.
Can you elaborate on this? You criticize what you call a term that you borrow from a work of a sociologist. The term is the memory theater. How Germany has come to terms with its past and the role of the Jews in it. Can you elaborate how it looks exactly?
True, yeah, for sure. The name of this sociologist is Michael Bodemann, who has taught all his life in Canada, but now is living in Berlin. And I found this book by coincidence, actually, almost like a message in a bottle, when I was in a library doing research for my PhD. That was like 10 years ago. And the book had been written in the mid-90s, trying to come to terms with a new kind of new kind of arrangement of a German way to remember the Second World War, because you can see different phases within German history of dealing with the past. And in each one of those phases, the Jews would play a central role, but the role they had to play would be different, because in a way, serving as an extra, it really depends on the script that you're being taught, and the script has always been written by German mainstream society after the Second World War and even before that. So the theater of memory really tries to understand how from the mid-80s on, a kind of memorial culture, Erinnerungskultur, memory culture, became dominant within German society that would use the memory of the killed Jews during the Holocaust, during the Shoah, and put them in the center of the reinvention of the German self as a Weltmeister der Erinnerung, as a world champion of memory, which really is a very successful marketing term for the new Germany, because everywhere I go, people would repeat that kind of phrase of Germany being a model and remembering its own atrocities. So in a way, that was really a great selling point being made by Richard von Weizsäcker in the mid-80s in a seminal speech on May 8th, 1985, I think. And what he was saying is that, look, the Jews, they are the secret of the Jewish faith is memory, and its clue to redemption, Erlösung, is memory. And because the clue of redemption for the Jews is memory, it should be for the Germans as well. So what you find here is that a German chancellor is using a Jewish religious tradition he curiously takes from the Hasidic Jews, and he's putting that to the center of a German idea of memory. And I think he doesn't even want to imply something that he still does by using the term redemption, that he promises redemption to the German side by doing that kind of memory work.
And your problem with it, Max, is that you think it's hypocritical? Is that the problem, that it's not a genuine process of healing?
No, it's not about that. It's about the question of whose desire is dominant in that kind of memory. It's not about whether Germans are sincere in doing that. I totally believe they're sincere. The question is more that within a German discussion of whether to remember or not, which the new German right would say we shouldn't remember anymore, and the old German position, the mainstream German position would say yes, we should remember about the stuff we have done. There's no real space for anything that you could call a Jewish memory or a Jewish self-definition that is not being overwhelmed by the German desire to become good again. That is the point.
I think that what struck me is that you're looking at this interaction of four elements: the personal, the national, the past, and the present, which I suppose is natural for any kind of memory. And it seems like what you're saying is that there is no room for individual Jewish identity because they are flattened into one singular group of people who represent in the German mind, a German psychological problem and historical problem. And that they don't have a say in their own memory of the past. What do you think of that approach? Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And I think that becomes more problematic the more diverse the Jewish community has become ever since the immigration of Soviet Jews and later Israeli Jews and Jews from all over the world to Germany starting in the 90s. So now we see that the function that is being projected onto the Jewish side as being survivors of Nazi atrocities on the one hand is kind of getting more remote from the reality of a Jewish community that is everything that you find in other communities as well. It's queer, it's diverse in its political positions, it's coming from all over the place, and it doesn't really fit into that framework being lined out by the idea of the theater of memory.
What does it mean for Germany's relationship with its minorities, not just the Jewish one? I mean, is it for you that the Jews are part of this community of minorities, or are they a separate category because of the past and this culture of memory? And how do they feed each other? Is there any cross-fertilization at all?
Yeah. Well, I think I got to respond to that question in two parts. One would be the way minorities, very much like this old idea of divide et impera, are being given different functions in a public domain, right? They're having different discourse position being given to them, granted to them. Let me give you one example for that. Over 90% of the Jews living in Germany today come from outside of Germany. Either they are born there or their parents have been born outside of Germany. So by any definition, you would say that the Jewish community is a migrant community. Now, there's one central discourse about belonging in Germany called integration, which we haven't talked about yet, but that is at the center of my first nonfiction book, which is the idea that people who come to Germany, who migrate to Germany, have to integrate, they have to adopt. This idea is being put on groups in different degrees, if you want so. And now looking at the Jewish group in particular, they're never being asked if they're integrated well, which is interesting because, as I already said, they are a migrant community. Why aren't they asked? Because their function is a different one. Their function is not the one usually being given to a migrant, which would be to behave well and then to kind of affirm that Germany is a pluralistic, open society. But the Jewish side is being made to represent the Jewish communities that have been killed. And that is something that really is very far away from the reality of what the Jewish community actually is, because it's not by continuity, or if you look at the lines of families that are living in Germany today, it's not a continuity with whatever has been here before the Second World War. So there's really a bit of a curious split in the way the Jewish side is being constructed and the way the Jewish side is actually being made of different people from different places. So that is like the Jewish side. And then you find the other minorities. Let's take one that has been invented in the last 20 years, which is the Muslim side, which wasn't Muslim in the 90s, but now in the last 20 years, I'm sure you've seen that development in Israel or in the US as well, that people that used to be addressed as Arabs or Turks or just foreigners are now being labeled as Muslims. And they really have a very different role to play, and they have different questions to answer to. So yes, there's a huge difference in the functions being put on the Jewish or the Muslim side. And at the same time, there are Jewish-Muslim interactions. And you see, I'm kind of grappling with the adjectives here because in a way, the Muslim is already being a construct being put from the outside, just as the Jewish side. And that's my last point for that question, if you look at places like the Maxim Gorki Theater in Berlin, which has really developed a concept called post-migrant theater, we can see something like a contact zone of Jewish and minority positions, we could call them Muslim, that kind of tries to find or define a space of self-definition that is being different from the space being granted by mainstream German society.
Well, I think this is a very interesting avenue of exploration because it is relevant for other countries too. The question of solidarity, of shared experiences of different minorities. And, the question of Jews in Germany is so complicated because of their very particular history. And I want to ask you if somehow the very singular history of the Holocaust somehow, ironically, gives Jews a protected status against the rise of the far right because it's not considered legitimate in Germany to target Jews as much as in the past. And does that in turn feed into a sort of temptation among some German Jews to play along with the divide and conquer mentality? Like, we're protected, so we don't have to worry so much about the rise of the far right, even if they're targeting other minorities in Germany?
Well, yes and no. Again, I think you find something, and that is really at the heart of the argument I'm trying to make. You find a very outspoken protectionism of the Jewish side by mainstream German society, which would always say that it's in their greatest interest to protect the Jews and to prevent anything like this to ever happen again. But at the same time, you find and you see anti-Semitic incidents happening in Germany, and they are on the rise. They're happening more than they did 10 years ago.
It's been well documented.
And yes, well documented. And just a year ago, you had the attack at the synagogue in Halle, and you'd find German political figures, prominent political figures, acting like this comes as a great shock to them. And this idea of shock really is something that you find time and again if you talk about attacks on Jews, that the German side has been, and this is what I like kind of try to work on in my nonfiction, that the German side has been so focused on its self-image that it misses to kind of live up to the actual situation we're in, because we're in a situation where the situation for minorities is becoming more threatening and more dangerous, but the German side just keeps on acting like it's still the same pluralistic, normalized, good theater of memory society that it kind of invented for itself in the 80s and then kind of acted out all through the 90s, and then opening up in the World Championship 2006, taking out the German flags and saying, we can finally be proud of Germany again. This is what we're still in on the one side, and we just slowly see a bit of a change on the German side to kind of accept that this whole idea of becoming good, of the good Germany, may have been further from reality than people would have liked to believe.
Max, can you unpack for us the concept of de-integration? It seems like, as you said before, but also in the book, it's quite clear that it's a plea against the German expectations from the minorities to integrate and adapt. Is it similar or identical, in your view, to multiculturalism that Angela Merkel famously said utterly failed?
She wasn't the only one to criticize it.
Yeah, but
but
she said it in no uncertain terms. I think 10 years ago or so. Is it really a call for multiculturalism, but in earnest? In
radical diversity terms.
Well, I'm happy we got 40 minutes for this podcast, because there's a lot to unpack here. Well, because in a way, first, to explain what deintegration means, I have to explain a bit what integration means in the German context, because it does mean something very different from what it meant in the States in the 60s and 70s when people were talking about integrated schools.
And it's not just a melting pot concept.
No, it's not. I think what we're talking about when we talk about integration, we're talking about the central paradigm for belonging in Germany, which means that minorities have to adopt, and not only in a way that they have to keep, like they have to kind of uphold certain laws and have to not be criminal and all that, and to speak German, but also to adhere to a certain culture. Integration always has this idea, this excess of adopting to a specific German culture, and the promise of integration is harmony. And that is very important, because I think that is different from, let's say, a more Anglo-Saxon tradition of political thought, that you always imagine a society, no matter how pluralistic it is, as being a harmonious society, at least in its ideal trajectory. And I would argue that is really a non-democratic concept of how pluralistic societies work, because they're not really promising you any kind of harmony, but rather a greater degree of self-definition, maybe, or a greater degree of autonomy. So that'd be a different concept. And I think multiculturalism and things like inclusion as a concept still maintain this idea of a center of society that is dominant and that is able to define what culture people have to adhere to. This is really what the integration paradigm means. And deintegration is trying to think about, or to point to, a different kind of paradigm for belonging, not only within German society, but also within a tradition of thinking about pluralistic democracies. And this idea really tries to put the focus not on dominant society and on its traditions of political thought and desires for harmony and dominance, but rather to think about society in a different way, to say, look, we don't really, not only do we not have the center of society, but also by now we are strong enough as minorities to not respond to this call to integrate. Rather, what deintegration wants to do is to say, no, wait, we're not accepting your claim to integrate or your demand to integrate, but rather we are defining the position where we are right now as a part of this German culture or German society. And that, I think, is something that Jews have done for the last 1,700 years in Germany, because they have been a part of Germany, but not being a part of mainstream German society. At first, because they weren't accepted, but in a second way also because they kind of stuck to their own traditions and own perspectives. And I think that really is a major shift in how we think about society and how minorities are a part of it, because in a way you see, or you start to see, that people like Theodor Adorno, Hannah Arendt, Heinrich Heine, all those people may have been important not because they were German, but because they were Jewish. And suddenly things turn around, and suddenly you start to see that the integration paradigm really is not telling you a lot about how difference is being maintained in a society and not just kind of being eradicated.
What and how does that overlap with with your approach to radical diversity, or what is the radical diversity piece of it?
Right. I think deintegration would be something like a tool or strategy, whereas radical diversity would be more of a concept of the society we are aiming at. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if I'm talking about a shift of paradigm, then I'm trying to point to a way to think about society that is not thinking about diversity in a way that the integration paradigm does, which would be always as a problem. Because that's the thing. If you're talking about integration, what you're saying is that the biggest threat to society is its internal diversity. And radical diversity would say, no, we have to flip this around. Because as long as we think about diversity as a problem, we are still within the train of thought of folkish thinking of the AfD, basically. We're not putting up any real counter concepts. We're just saying, let's be a bit more moderate than trying to play out this idea of German dominance too much. And if you adopt a perspective of radical diversity, which is not mine, by the way, but coming from the Institute for Social Justice and Radical Diversity I'm a part of, which we have founded in Berlin some 20 years ago. If you adopt this idea of radical diversity, then what you start to see is that the thing that makes society resisting those ideas of integration, those ideas of homogeneity, those ideas of right-wing violence, it's the very diversity that people have been trying to problematize for the last decades. So I'm really trying to shift perspective here and try to say that it's not diversity as the biggest problem, but the biggest asset that a pluralistic democracy has to counter the surge of the new right.
Okay, I want to leave some time to talk about one of my favorite topics in the whole world, which is art and politics. And you are the perfect person to discuss it with because you are also a poet and therefore an artist. You're engaged in all sorts of non-conventional forms of literature, if I might describe it like that. What do you think is the interaction between art and politics as you experience it?
Yes, thank you for that question. I love to talk about that as well. And then again, talking about art always leaves a bit of an empty feeling in my brain, in my stomach, because I feel like you would actually have to see art. But anyway, let's try to do it and just
post-pandemic we will.
Yeah, right. We should because we're talking about something like de-integration, Jewish, Muslim hegemony. We're also talking about stuff that has been developed, and it's kind of already realizing this swing of the pendulum between the political and the artistic sphere. But again, let me go back to post 45, because in a way that really is the venturing point and the point where I feel a lot of stuff has been said we're still dealing with today in the German context, at least. And you find there's something that I would describe in my newest nonfiction book, Gegenwartsbewältigung, as the invention of the good art or the good culture, which really makes sense if you look at the problem Germans had to face after 45, which was that the whole tradition of German thinking had, in a way, been put into question by what it ended up with, which was National Socialism. So, in a way, the German society had to ask itself how to reinvent something like a good reference point for its own self-definition. So what they came up with was the idea that German politics had been bad, but German culture had been good. So in a way, the thing they traded off was to put away the German political tradition, while still working with it, but in a more subtle way, and at the same time really kind of going after Goethe and Schiller and Richard Wagner, even though some of those writers were harshly anti-Semitic and racist and sexist and all that. So you find this idea of good German art, and in order to stabilize this idea, you had to dissect the idea of art from politics, because once you put politics back into art, you'll have to think about how the art of Richard Wagner, for example, has been kind of induced by his anti-Semitic ideas, which are widely known. So you really have this curious situation where you find a German, like, very dominant idea of non-political art. And against that, we have developed, I think, within the Maxim Gorki Theater, but also within my publishing house, the Verlagshaus Berlin, a different agenda. And one way I've described it now, or I'm trying to describe it right now, is as militant poetry, militant art, which in German would be wehrhafte Poesie or wehrhafte Kunst. And it's yet again trying to shift the way we use and read and perceive art away from the idea that art is something that is inspiring us to do great things, so that it's leading society to a better place, something that would really be the idea of the good culture, the good art I just described, and rather to think about art as a part of our strategies of resisting. And that is something I think when you go back in time that you can find with all minorities, that, and also political minorities and also other minorities, that art has always been a strategy of resisting. And once you move away from this idea of good culture, you have this huge archive of art as resistance that is opening up, because you suddenly are able to see that archive and to kind of switch through it and find answers for today.
I'm assuming that this is what stands really at the basis of the festival of Jewish Muslim hegemony. So maybe you can talk about that. But I'd also like to ask you in relation to this, whether you see, and going back to what you said earlier about the integration and radical diversity and your view for the future of German society, do you think that Jews and Muslims in Germany today are really partners on an equal footing in this journey, or just members of the same coalition, but since they're coming from very different places, the roles are different?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up again. I think there's a lot of topics that are kind of dropping away left and right. We're yet again, I think we'll have to be precise about what we're talking about right now. We're talking about my festival. The Days of the Jewish-Muslim Hegemony, Tage der jüdisch-muslimischen Leitkultur. That was really a mix of just producing straight-out artistic fake news. We already, with the Radical Jewish Culture Days in 2017, we established a Jewish fake news channel, which was called Jews News Today. And we just started producing bullshit news about how, I don't know, the Deutsche Bank, the German bank, would introduce a Jew quota, or how Jews would take over all German theaters and start kind of start doing different art that wouldn't be as boring as all the German theaters.
I'd be careful if I were you.
I was going to say, this sounds like great art, but so dangerous because some people won't get the joke.
That is amazing. And there's this is actually what I'm aiming for. There was this one writer in the 1920s, which I really adore. His name is Kurt Tucholsky. And something that he said was that satire is successful if people take it serious.
Well, you could also wind up arrested, like the Yes Men, those guys who did big pranks and went on and, apologized for the major chemical companies behind the Bhopal incident. I mean, they went on BBC and impersonated executives and got into big trouble. So that could happen too.
But I think you're putting the finger right into something that art has been doing in Germany in the last years, which has really been at the forefront of political action. The idea of freedom of art grants you a greater wiggle space in the realm of ideology, because if you're doing art, you don't have to be like on the very ideological line of the political people you are kind of associating with. That's one thing. And art can be much more the thing that art can do is it can put the second step before the first, which if you do that in politics, you're just gonna trip and may fall. And that is something that art is great in doing. And that'd be the Jewish Muslim hegemony on the one hand sounds like a joke, and on the other hand is really trying to point to the idea of not having a German hegemony, not having the idea of Deutsche Leitkultur, which is another term like integration, trying to have this idea of cultural dominance installed in German society, but rather to think about society as a place of many different hegemonies, which in the end, ultimately would mean no hegemony at all, but rather to think about society as a multi-centered place. And I think art and the Jewish fake news and all the things we did would be a place where you can actually put those things together, and where you're able to also talk about the difficulties that may arise without kind of putting that into politics right away. Let's talk about something like revenge. That's something we've been working on a lot. Jewish revenge has been with us ever since 2016 and the first De-Integration Congress.
Oh, I thought you were going to say ever since Tarantino's film *Inglourious Bastards*.
Of course. Well, of course, that's what it's about. Sure. And I think there should be a place for that in art, as there should be for the vision that fake news entail. Because there's something curious about fake news, which I find interesting, that it always produces a kind of truth that the listener would like to hear. It's not always a pleasant truth. It could be, I know that Muslims, rape women, and this is why I want to see those news of them raping women. And if they don't, I just turn to Russia Today and they're going to tell me. But you can turn this around, right? You can also say, from a Jewish perspective, if we're doing radical Jewish culture days, I would like to see a German society that is different than the one today. So we're just inventing that, and we're just sending a different kind of news, and people are going to either take it serious or not take it serious. We're just going to tell this different story. And now that you say it, we actually had someone with our last Jewish News Today clip in 2017, where we said we're going to occupy the German theaters. We had someone actually coming to our theater and interrupting our show because she was being pissed off by the fact that we're making fun of occupations. She was like, I'm going to show you what a real occupation looks like. And then she would be interrupting our show in order to show us how a real occupation of a theater would look like.
Wow, this is fascinating, and I think that we have to start wrapping up. Now, I'm not going to promise that this is going to be our last question, but it might be. And it follows exactly on what you're talking about. I want to ask you about art and politics in a broad sense. You yourself point out that when art becomes too critical in too dogmatic a way, it can become agitprop. So what is the difference between that and art that, on the other hand, is too much of the good art supporting the general mainstream culture? And in that case, it very quickly becomes prop. Just the propaganda part. How do we draw the line? How do we distinguish between these two? Is there a sweet spot where art is simply authentic?
Oh, you just used the A word.
I did.
I'm really skeptical of the idea of authentic art, which is not to say that I wouldn't like want people to do art that they feel is the art they want to do. But I find that, and let me put this in maybe a bit of an extreme phrasing, but I feel like I've been watching the same theater performance over and over again for the last 10 years. And that is a performance that is always going, taking its material from the body of the actor and its biography and the actress, and putting that on stage. And there's no fiction, there's really no play going on, but rather a very didactic idea of teaching the audience what racism, what anti-Semitism, what all that kind of stuff means. And I think that makes for very bad art. And the same goes for the Jewish side. If we're talking about Jewish representation of German stages, what you'd usually find was black and white images, violence, a bit of a dark and sad mood. So you find all those vectors, which could be very diverse, actually, because the way to put things on stage can be extremely different, but you'd always find the same. So in a way, looking for revenge or looking for irony or looking for, fake news was a way to get away from this boring and repetitive kind of representation of the Jewish side. So it's not really about authenticity, but rather about fiction. And I think what I'm interested in, if we're talking about the difference of good art and agitprop art, and I would totally agree, that is the actual problem that we face, those two sides. The good art as the morally good art with no connection to politics, then I would say that we have to look for art not as an extension of politics, but rather as a kind of meta politics, something that is really putting into question the idea of we and them. Because in the end, there's no Jews and there's no Germans and there's no Muslims. This is all constructed in society, which doesn't mean that it's not deadly, that it's not killing you, the construct, which it obviously is. It's like keeping you, it's making you drown in the Mediterranean Sea. It's keeping you from certain borders and all that. But art, I think, should be clear about the fact that those things are constructed and that the construct is being kind of carried by an idea of goodness and the badness of the other. And I think this is something that art, as opposed to politics, really can kind of make visible. And I think politics can't do that. So art really has a very, very different function and a very different scope of doing things than politics do.
You convinced me.
Yeah, me too. All right. On this note, Max Czollek, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
And also big thanks to Itai Shalom, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the German government for sponsoring this special series on Israel's relationship with the EU and Germany. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 600 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And do not forget to follow Dalia and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.